And okay, so here's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about the English department's new textbook policy for college writing, and then I'm going to take you through our page, which has a bunch of readings. And then I am going to talk about one assignment that ties into one section of the readings. And then we'll have questions about that. Then Robert's going to take over and he's going to talk about another section of the readings and he's going to give you another assignment. And then we'll have some questions at the end. So, I am recording this. We're going to choose one of these workshops to put up on the web so that people can come back and review it later. So the first thing I want to do, this is the English department homepage. So I want to go to the Program in Writing and Rhetoric link. And then I'm going to go to, there are a couple different options here. I'm going to click on Program in Writing and Rhetoric for Faculty. And I really hope that this is a page that everybody is visiting quite frequently, especially when you draw up your syllabi for the upcoming semester. There is a lot of information on this page that we want you to be aware of. So, for instance, there's information about using portfolios in your class. There's a link that you can click on that will take you to support services. If you have a student who his first language is not English, or a student who needs tutoring, there are a lot of different lists of support services here. There's an explanation of the difference between giving an N and giving an F. There's our attendance policy. There's information if you're teaching 1500 about living writers. So there's sample syllabi. There's lots of stuff that's going to be particularly important for you when you're writing up a syllabus. But I'm not going to talk about those things today. Instead, I'm going to click on Readings for English 1100. And I want to talk a little bit about our new textbook policy. So many of you, if you've taught for us in the past, you might have used a themed course. You might have had a course on, a lot of people teach a course using the theme of work. Or you might have, taught a themed course about media or current events or lots of different things, and you might have used a textbook of readings. And we are asking you not to do that for the upcoming semester and for every other semester. We're asking you not to order textbooks for English 1100 anymore. And there are two reasons for that. One is to save students money. The university is trying to be aware of how much textbooks cost our students and to reduce their textbook costs. So that's part of it. But the other part of it is our teaching focus, is that the problem with themed courses can be that if you're teaching a college writing section that's focused on work, you end up teaching people about work, right? That's the subject matter. And writing is merely a way to carry out a conversation about that subject matter. But we don't want that to be the case. So we think it's very important in a college writing class that the subject of the class is writing and the writing process. That is what students are focused on. That is what they are learning about. They're learning about what writing is, how writing works, what techniques that they can use to get a handle on their own writing process. Now, does that mean you can't bring in other readings? No, it doesn't. If you've got readings that you think work really well for your class and you want to use those readings in your class, certainly you can, although today we're going to hopefully give you some ways to think about those readings and to tie those readings in to the sort of things that we're going to talk about. But you can use them. You just can't ask your students to buy them. Any readings that you want to use in the class, you need to provide your students either by giving them handouts if, God willing, we meet face to face again, or by putting them up electronically on the website. So you can use your own readings with some caveats that we're going to talk about today. Having said that, we have created a list of readings that we think are particularly useful for our writing class. We've put them up on this reading page online. We've divided these readings into 4 different categories. The first is the writing process. I'm going to talk about that category today. The second category of readings is rhetoric, genre, and discourse. And Robert's going to talk about that category. There are also categories of readings that talk about multimedia, both using multimedia, using video and audio in the class, but also, if you're brave enough, having students compose in multimedia, having them create videos. And then the final category is about research. But I want to talk first about the writing process. So I'm going to click on this list of readings. And here are these readings. And you can click on any of them, and it will take you right to the reading. So you can either you can either copy the document and put it into your Blackboard and give it out to students that way, or you can copy the link and make the link available for students so that they can get to the reading that way. Now, there are really, in the category of the writing process, there are really sort of 2 subcategories. The first here is using writing to explore with minimal editing. And we think that the writing process is a really important subject for dealing. It's something that it's important to talk to your students about. And the reason for that is that students tend to come into the college writing class thinking of writing really in terms of forms, of what the writing should look like at the end. So an essay should look a certain way. A narrative essay should have certain parts and look a certain way. An informative essay, should have an introduction, it should have a thesis, it should have paragraphs. They sort of focus on the final product. And the problem with that is that if you only look at the final product, even if you could replicate that final product, even if you could identify what a good essay looks like at the end, which I think is a questionable proposition, but even if you could do that, it doesn't tell you anything about how to get there. Because writers don't get to that final product by putting things in place like a jigsaw puzzle. Well, first I've got the introduction, I'm going to fit that there, then I'm going to write this paragraph, I'm going to fit that there. The writing process just doesn't work that way. So we need to give students techniques for doing the writing, the meandering, the thinking, the rethinking, the sharing, that whole process that leads up to the final product, but that kind of gets erased. Everybody sees the final product, but they don't see how to get there. So the first part of this category, which is using writing to explore with minimal editing, is really about generating a lot of writing. It's about figuring things out through writing. So instead of figuring everything out ahead of time and knowing what you're going to say and putting that into writing, you use writing to figure stuff out. That's really what the first section is about, the first section of readings. And then the second section of readings is about, well, what do you do once you've got a bunch of writing? How do you share it? How do you start a conversation with it? How do you revise it? And also on reflecting as you go along, thinking through what's happening, what am I learning, what's going on here. So that's an overview to this part of the readings on the writing process. What I would like to do is to share an assignment that I do that ties into these readings. And that's really what we want you to do here in this workshop today. I'm going to give you an assignment that ties into the readings. Robert's going to give you an assignment that ties into a different section of the readings. But the point isn't that you use our assignments. You're welcome to do that, but that's not really the point. The point is to think through your assignments and to figure out, how am I going to use my assignment, not just to say, okay, they're going to do a 5-page paper, and then we'll get that done and we'll do another 5-page paper. Rather than just doing a paper and then doing a paper and then doing another paper, the idea is tying these papers into talking about the writing process. So that's really what we want you to take away, is we want you to think through your assignments and ask, how can we use these assignments to get students involved in a conversation about the way that writing works? So I'm going to take you to an assignment that I use called Un-Persuasive Writing. And I think there are a lot of readings in this first section that could be useful, but two that I think are really particularly useful, and they're in that page. One is A Way of Writing by William Stafford, and the other is How to Improve Your Writing, Free Writing Exercises by Peter Elbow. These are both essays, short readable essays that talk about how it's important to put writing down on paper without worrying about where it's going and without worrying about it being any good. And so early in the semester, I simply give the students these readings, and I ask them to go home, read them, and then just write a brief reflection about them. And then we come into class and we share those reflections and we talk about them. And that does two things. It starts them thinking about the writing process as the subject matter of the course. But it does another really important thing. Right from the beginning, they're doing it. They're using writing not as a way to get to a paper that's going to be graded. They're using writing as a way to test out ideas and begin a conversation. And that's really kind of the entire point of the section, is that writing is not always about getting you to a final product. Writing is sometimes about getting you thinking. So I do that early in the semester. Then the next thing I do is I give them a handout. And I hope, I'm going to skip down to the bottom here, because the last thing, I sent you all this in your email. When the last part of it is, probably should be the first part of it, but I have it at the end. The last part of it is the handout that I give to students. So when we begin this writing project, I give them this handout. And I want you to notice what I'm doing at the beginning. I did not used to do this when I was a teacher, and I really have learned to do it, that it's really important. Is the first thing I do is I tell my students, not just here's the kind of writing that I want you to do, and here's the assignment, here are the steps, but I tell them, here's why I'm giving you this assignment. I think it's because students really misunderstand us. We think we're communicating one thing, but really what they're getting is another thing. And it's just really useful to have this in writing. Here's what I want you to get out of this assignment. Maybe you'll get it, maybe you won't get it, but here's why I'm giving it in the first place. The other thing is, I hope all of you are, when you give students a writing project, I hope you're giving them written directions, not just oral directions, but written directions. It's really important if a student goes to the writing center and says they're working on a writing project and the writing tutor says, well, what's the assignment? Students sometimes get it wrong, or some students sometimes don't even know. I think it's persuasive writing. I'm not really sure. And having this handout to show the writing tutor is super important. Sometimes students come to me in my office as writing program director because they're really confused about something. And I'll say, you do sound confused. Let's take a look at the writing assignment. And they don't have it. Sometimes that's on them, but sometimes it's because the instructor didn't give it to them. So I hope you're writing out your assignments so that students can refer to them. So having said that, I'm going to scroll back up. And let me tell you what I'm going to do here. I've given you like 9 pages. There's a lot of stuff here because that's just the way I am. I'm a little bit anal that way. This document in its entirety, it goes and breaks out class by class, and I've even sort of broken it down into how many minutes it takes. So what I'm doing for each class. I'm not going to go over that right now because that's just too much. But you could have it to refer to if you want to. But what I'm going to do is just give a quick overview of sort of class to class, how I break this assignment up over a 2.5-week period. And the assignment, this is, I've laid it out with the assumption that I'm teaching a class that meets 2 times a week. You would have to kind of change it, I guess, if you were meeting 3 times a week. But what I'm really trying to do here is I'm trying in this assignment to have them consciously use writing to figure things out. So instead of sort of saying, what do I want it to look like at the end? You know, what is the final piece supposed to look like? I'm really deliberately trying to say, I don't know. I don't know the question. That's not so important to me. What I want you to do is to use lots of little bits of writing to figure stuff out. So we'll do a little bit of writing, we'll come back, we'll talk about it. We'll do another little bit of writing, we'll come back, we'll talk about it. So the idea is not writing to say something that you already know, but writing to explore something that you don't know. And what I do is I take an assignment that's often used in college English classes, and that's the persuasive assignment. And students are usually very familiar with that assignment. And I want them to take that assignment and to really look at it differently. Because persuasive writing, the way it's taught in many English classes, is sort of an exercise rather than a real thing. So I begin in class by asking them to just take some time to do a little bit of free writing. And I ask them to tell me about a time in their life when somebody used words to persuade them. So they just take some time to write about that. When were you persuaded? And then after they write about that, I just want them to tell me about it. So after they write about that for a little while, I say, now just take 5 minutes or so and analyze what happened. Try to explain why you think that you were persuaded. And they do that, and they do that writing, and then they share that writing in groups, and then we talk about it. And one of the things that I want them to discover, and it almost always happens, is people are very rarely persuaded. They're certainly not persuaded in the sort of topics that typically one writes about in a college English class. Like I ask them, you know, has anybody's mind ever been changed by a paper about a topic? Is anybody, for instance, abortion is a topic that they write about quite frequently. And I say, has anybody started out pro-life and then read a paper by their classmate and then wound up pro-choice? And they all kind of laugh. Of course they don't do that. So one of the things that I want to start with is that, well, persuasion doesn't happen a lot. And when they share their own persuasive stories and I ask, why were you persuaded? Often it's got nothing to do with, well, somebody had a really great argument. More often than not, it's just like, well, I really trusted this person. I knew that he knew what he was talking about, or I believed in him or her. Or sometimes it's just the place you are in your life. You've been thinking about that topic for a while, and you've just come to a point where you're ready to hear something that you weren't ready to hear before. So we talk about not only how difficult persuasion is, but the fact that persuasion almost never has to do with a smart and sound argument, in spite of the fact that that's often what we teach them in persuasive papers. Well, you need to construct a sound argument. But that's often not the case when it comes to actually why people are persuaded. So we talk about this idea of persuasion, and then I spend the rest of the class saying, well, I do want you to do some writing on a persuasive topic. And we brainstorm for topics, and I ask them to come up with a range of sizes. So they have the big topics, which are about their sort of global topics: abortion, capital punishment, legalization of drugs, global warming, big public topics. But I also really push them to get smaller topics. So I talk about sort of medium-sized topics that don't affect the whole world, but maybe a particular group. So maybe William Patterson students, or maybe you know, going online during COVID, or having to take freshman writing classes when they don't want to. And then I also ask them to come up with sort of smaller topics that are very personal, that affect maybe one person or just a small group of people. So maybe somebody writing about why he thinks his roommate should break up with his girlfriend, or why his parents shouldn't make him go to church on Sundays, or something that's very specific to them. So they get a range of possible topics. I send them home and I ask them to sort of, you know, I say, come in with maybe 9 topics from some of these different categories. So they come in the second class, and they've got a bunch of topics, and they share them with other people so they can get a sense of what the whole possibilities are in the class. And then what I want to do in the second class is we've talked in the first class about how persuasion is kind of difficult, and now I want to talk about a range of possible outcomes. So I want to get them away from thinking of either you persuade them or you don't, either you're right or you're wrong. So they tend to think of topics either you're pro-life or you're pro-choice. Either you think global warming is a threat or you think global warming is a hoax. And that's not a very, those binaries aren't very useful because nobody persuades anybody. But we try to think of like, well, are there other outcomes other than absolute persuasion that might be achievable? So for instance, maybe two people talking with different perspectives, maybe you don't convince somebody of your perspective, but maybe you get them to see that there simply is another perspective. Maybe they thought there was only one perspective. Or maybe you get them to understand why you believe what you do, even if they still disagree with you. So there are a bunch of different possible outcomes besides total persuasion. Having had this discussion, I say, okay, pick a topic, jump in, begin writing. And at that point, if I begin writing in class, I get to go around to them. Some people are sort of stuck. Some people are confused about what I want. I get to talk to them. But they go home and they generate some rough writing, and then they bring it into class. And then the third class, what I really want them to do is now imagine, now that they've got a little bit of writing, imagine somebody who sees things differently, what I would call a resistant reader. So I really try to emphasize, students want to say, oh, you want me to write the other reasons now. And I try to emphasize that I'm not really looking for reasons. I'm not really looking for wrong or right at this point. What I'm looking for is, can they imagine somebody who sees it differently? And I ask them, well, who would that person be? How would that person be different from you? Does that person have different values? Does that person have different life experiences than you do? Do they have a different political view than you do? Do they trust different kinds of people? Are they younger? Are they older? Are they different race, a different gender? You know, try to imagine the kind of person who would see this topic differently and think about why, and just sort of write about who that person is. Don't write an argument yet. Just write about who that person is. And I give them 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes in class to do that writing. Then I ask them to share it in a group, and I ask them to get other people in the group to help them flesh out and imagine who this different person is. And then we'll share some of those in class and we'll talk about it. And I want to really push them towards not this is right or this is wrong, but these are who these different people are, and these are why they have different perspectives. So once I do that, I ask them to go home and generate 2 or 3 more pages of writing. Again, rough writing, not final product writing, but 2 to 3 more pages of writing from the point of view of that resistant reader. And then on the fourth class, actually in the fifth class, I'm sorry, my mistake. The fourth class, they come in with these 2 pieces of writing: the original piece of writing that they did, and then the second piece of writing, who's from the point of view of a resistant reader. So these 2 pieces of writing, what are they going to do with them? Again, I emphasize, I don't care who's right or who's wrong. I don't care who's more persuasive or less persuasive. That would be the point of a traditional persuasive paper, but it's not the point of my unpersuasive paper. What I really want them to do is to compare these 2 people and to explain what the gaps are. What is it that's keeping these 2 people separate? What is it that makes them see this topic from different points of view? And then the opposite. Even though they have different perspectives, what is the potential for common ground here? Or do they share common concerns? Do they share common values? Like, really look at what the difference is, but also what the potential commonalities are. And again, they'll do that for themselves, but I'll also use groups to do it. And then I'll ask some of the groups to report, and we'll talk about that goal. And it's a very different goal for them to use writing to explore similarities and differences. And I'll try to point out for them that's what they've been doing. They've been using writing to think through these different perspectives. So then what do they do with the writing that they've got? Okay, we've got, look, you've got these two pieces of writing. They're interesting. They share some things. Where are we going to go to now? Well, we brainstorm possibilities. What can they do with this? And the only thing that I tell them that I don't want them to do is I don't want them to go back and write the traditional persuasive essay. But I want them to see other possibilities. So we brainstorm for possibilities. Maybe they can do a dialogue. Maybe they can have a bunch of different voices talking to each other. Maybe they can do a story where this topic comes up and we have two different characters who encounter the topic from a different point of view. Maybe they can write a letter, either a letter to someone else or maybe a letter to themselves. Maybe we could do a blog or a video and really try to throw out as many possibilities as we can without saying anything's wrong. And then I say, okay, figure out what you want to do, go home and do that. And that'll be your first draft of this paper. And so that's pretty much the assignment. Later in the semester, there is an opportunity to come back to this assignment because I do have them in my college writing class. Sometimes I'll have them go back and pick a piece that they've already done and revise it into a different genre. So if they've, at that point, if they've done a dialogue or if they've done a letter, maybe they can turn that into a persuasive paper, and maybe at this point it'll be a better one than it would have in the first place. Or maybe they have an opportunity to do some research. So I say, okay, go out and find a real person and interview them and see what they say about this topic. Or maybe go find a reading that involves this topic and incorporate that reading into your paper. So potentially there's a chance later in the semester to come back on this, although that's not necessarily the case. They don't necessarily have to do that. So that's it. I'm gonna go back to square one here. I'm gonna stop sharing. How to stop sharing? How do I? Well, okay, maybe I'm not gonna. Yes, I just stopped sharing. So now we're back, and I am going to unmute everybody's microphone. Oh, I can't unmute your microphone, but I'm going to ask if anybody has any questions either about the textbook policy or the website or about my assignment in particular. And if you just use that little raise hand guy at the bottom, and then I'll call on you if you've got a question or a comment or concern. Okay, Nick.
Yeah, it sounds in a way like you talk about a dialogue and story and vignettes. And are you talking about persuasive creative writing?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, I mean, if students I'm going to have students do dialogue, students do a story, and I like that. I think stories create experiences. You really want to shape people's opinions about them. You create an experience for them. But would you permit a student in your class to spend the semester writing stories?
Probably not, because it's not a fiction writing class, and I don't usually allow fiction in my college writing classes. But in this particular case, I would permit that as an option, because I think whenever you're giving an assignment, and this is really what I want to foreground for today, whenever you're giving assignment, you need to ask yourself, what do I want my students to get from this assignment? And what I want them to get from this assignment is to understand that they can use the process of writing to discover something that they didn't know. So for this assignment, for me, the genre that they end up writing at the end is not important to me. So I'm not giving them a chance to write a short story because I think it's important.
Chris, sorry. I just muted you by accident because we were getting crazy feedback on our end.
Sorry. So I guess the answer here is I would allow fiction for this assignment, even though I don't generally allow fiction, because even if they wrote a short story, it would get at what I wanted them to get at.
Now, how do you get, can you still hear me? You can still hear me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you began our discussion by saying, how many of you have ever been persuaded by an essay? How many of you have read an article about an opinion piece about abortion and came away with a different opinion? And everyone agreed that that never happened. So you started the semester by telling everybody that persuasive essays um, aren't effective.
I think the kind of persuasive essays that students write in English classes are almost never effective. And I would, this is a bit of an esoteric argument, but I would go on to say that I think most op-eds in the New York Times are not effective.
I agree.
Most columnists, they're writing to people who already agree with them.
Yeah, yeah. So ultimately, if I can't write a persuasive, if I can't get people to agree with me with a persuasive essay, what should I be writing?
I would answer that question. There are lots of different things that we're writing about. For this assignment, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, and I actually say this in the handout, I am less interested in persuasion. I'm more interested in connection. So if you can find a way to talk to somebody who's different from you and still have a sense of connection and understanding, I think that is valuable. I would value connection over persuasion.
Okay, all right.
I would also just add that I think there's a lot of value in being honest about the goals of a piece of writing and what it can accomplish, right? So I think you could make a very powerful argument that writing an essay or a dialogue or whatever it is that's meant to, for example, just increase the amount of empathy that a person has for another person they might not normally look through. That is an act of persuasion in the kind of broader, longer term sense. And I think the goals of a lot of the kinds of activities that we're talking about today are about just being more honest with students about what writing and communication does and where and how and under what conditions it does it.
In some ways, I would be more pleased if at the end of this assignment, the writer had changed his mind rather than the reader. To me, that would be a happier outcome. I want you as a writer to see something that you haven't seen at the beginning.
Agreed. I like that.
Any other either questions about this assignment or just questions about what it is we're trying to do here in a broader sense? Why are you asking me to use this reading list? What's the policy? Any questions about any of that? Lorraine?
Loretta.
Both Lorraine and Loretta have their hands raised. I'm going to go to Loretta. You're talking, and Lorraine, I'll go to you next. Loretta?
Okay. Which is odd because all my whole life people have called me Lorraine. But okay. So I just thought you were making
people call me Loretta.
Oh, that you're making that up. Nobody calls anyone Loretta. All right.
Listen. All right, let's start with Loretta.
Okay. When you say 2 to 3 pages, is that typed or handwritten? Because that is extremely... I can't even get a paragraph out of many people, especially boys.
Well, that's I'm really glad that you brought that up. That's one of the reasons I start with those readings, and we start with free writing. I think the reason that people do say, well, I can't write more than a paragraph, a lot of the time it's because they think of writing as sort of like, I got to write one sentence, I got to make sure it's correct, I got to write another. I think that we start with free writing so that I can show them, if you don't worry about the outcome, if you're not worried about editing, if you're not worried about where you're going, just sit down and write. And in fact, in the early in the semester, I just say, I just want 2 pages of writing. I don't care what it looks like. I don't care what it's about. I do think we need to train our students to write, to generate material without worrying about editing it, without worrying about if it's what I want or not. So I simply tell them, I'm not going to, you know what? I'm not going to give you credit unless you have 2 pages of writing. You can have 2 pages of crappy writing, but you got to have 2 pages of writing or you're not getting credit. And pretty quickly they learn how to generate writing. It doesn't have to be great.
The underpinning is that, and I've heard it out of their mouths, this generation, they're taught not even to have opinions and that everything's okay and you can't disagree with other people. That's just their thought. It's a slight apathy. I even had one girl say to me, yeah, we have no work ethic, meaning that I almost have to teach them that what you think in your brain does count and that you're allowed to say it and you should say it.
Yeah.
But they're taught this opposite thing.
But I mean, I think that the Peter Elbow essay really speaks to that. Yeah. Go ahead and be wrong. Go ahead and write mistakes. I mean, the point of writing is to get stuff on paper. It doesn't need to be right. I think that students have been taught that they, there are students who tell me, my teacher said, don't write anything until you know what you're going to say. So we really need to untrain them that way. And I think it's sort of assignments like this, I hope, are untraining them. They're saying the point is not to have a nice, neat 5-paragraph essay at the end. The point is spilling ideas onto the page and talking about them.
One more question, and then Loretta can go. Haha. Okay. My thing is like a process thing within the classroom because of high absentee rates, or they come in without the assignment. So it's hard when you put them in groups. So there's 2 or 3 who didn't do the writing. What do you do with them? They miss the whole step process. It just seems to almost like snowball. Right. And that to me is the biggest obstacle that I always have.
It is, and if you take a look at the breakdown of my assignment, there are lots of little steps, and it only works if students take all of those little steps.
Right.
So one thing that I do is I do a fair amount of the writing in class, so they have a chance in class to write it. Now, there'll still be students who write 2 words and set their pen down and stare out the window, right?
Yeah.
So there's no foolproof way to do this. But the other thing that I do is I say, okay, it's Tuesday. By Thursday, I need to see 600 words posted to the discussion board. And if you don't have 600 words posted to the discussion board, you lose credit for this assignment. And after about 6 of those, they fail the course. So you do have to, especially coming from high school where everything is about did you turn in the final paper, you do have to be, I do have to be pretty persistent about saying, I'm not worried about the final product. I believe you'll be fine with the final product if you go through these steps. But if you don't go through these steps, I'm going to penalize you. I'm going to report you to Starfish as this person's missed 3 assignments. So yeah, we do have to stay on top of students. And here's the thing, in college writing, sometimes even if you do stay on top of students, they don't do it anyway. Well, that's college writing.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Lorraine.
No, thanks, Lorraine. Okay. In terms of Blackboard, we still have the freedom to use it as we choose, right? Because I like the idea of giving the students the link to a lot of these readings, which are excellent. In fact, 2 of them I already used. The one on Vonnegut, How to Write with Style, and Peter Elbow, big fan of his, that non-edited rewriting.
I have to say, students generally really like these readings. They respond pretty favorably to them.
Yeah. Okay. But again, we don't have to do those discussion boards if we don't want to. It's whatever we deem to. It's our course on Blackboard.
Yeah, no one's telling you how to use Blackboard, although I have to say, for me, the discussion board is so useful because it gives me a way to make students accountable. They've got to log on. They've got to post it. It's very easy for me to keep track of their homework. I don't have to go around in their groups and collect homework. But no, you don't have to. And I do also want to emphasize, if I didn't make this clear before, you do not have to use any of the readings on there. You do not have to use all of the readings on there. You do not have to do them in the order that they're on there. So they're just on there as resources for you. I really urge you to take a look at them because I think they're useful, but it's up to you how you want to use them.
Right, they're very good. And do we still recommend a book, or don't even put that on the syllabus whatsoever?
You cannot ask your students to buy any books.
Yeah, but
So-
recommend, not buying. Recommend.
As long as you're, I would not order it from the bookstore.
No.
So no, I don't want you to order anything from the bookstore. If you want to say to your students, hey, here's a good book if you want to go out and buy it. But if you order it from the bookstore, even if it's recommended, they're going to misunderstand. They're going to buy it.
Got it.
Right. Diana. Diana, you got your hand up?
Yes, I did. Let me put it back down. All right, I have a question, and I've been seeing this as both a history and as an English instructor. How do you encourage them to read, especially the boys? Going back to what I think Loretta had said about how boys don't like to write in general, I've noticed that the boys tend to fall down on the written assignments more than the girls. How, if anybody has any tricks or any tips on how to encourage them to read? They don't seem to be a reading generation at all.
Yeah, I don't want to broaden this out into a discussion about reading and writing in general.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're asking, how do you, here are the links, here are the assignments,
Mm-hmm.
how do you make sure that they read them? Yeah, I don't. I mean, I ask them to post on it. It becomes pretty darn obvious if they haven't read it.
Oh, sure.
We come into class and we talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And does that mean some people don't read it? Sure, absolutely it does. But most of these readings are pretty short.
Mm-hmm.
And most of them are readable. And I find that, does everybody read it? No, but enough people read it. There's enough critical mass that I can do what I need to do in class.
Okay. Because I would just, like I said, if somebody had some sort of, trick that they would love to share, I would be happy to hear it. So, but that's encouraging. At least with the shorter, maybe they'll do it.
So Deborah and Katya have their hands up. I wanna maybe just you guys fairly quickly, because I don't want to shortchange Robert, because he's got some stuff to talk about. But there will be, if you've got questions that we don't answer, there will be time at the end of this to come back to them. But Katya, can I start with you?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. This is just to answer Diana. I don't call it a quiz, but I usually say, especially if it's English 1500 and reading a book, I say, I'm going to ask you a set of questions. I'm not going to call it a quiz. I tell them, but it's sort of like that. And so my experience has been that, yes, they read a little bit more, or they, in order to answer those questions. So that seems to have worked for me so far.
Okay, I'm going to go to Deborah, and then I'm going to move on to Robert's part of the presentation, but we will have time at the end. So Deborah? Deborah, if you're there, you need to unmute your mic. No, Deborah? There you are.
Yeah, a couple of things. I really like this assignment, the unpersuasive writing, because for the one reason, I think it was, as Loretta had said in the beginning, we have these young people who are coming out with no ideas of their own. This gives them a way of thinking outside of themselves and extending themselves. As far as the boys reading and writing, I don't know. I don't know what it's been. I've taught for, I think, 5 semesters, and my guys write. They write incredibly well. I don't know if it's because some of the type of the assignments that I've given really do go in on the side of this unpersuasive writing. Self-experiences that open up to outside experiences. And I find my boys, they really write, and they write well. And many of them have come up to me and said, I never thought I could write, and they find themselves writing. I think this will work.
Okay, so I wanna switch over to, I'm gonna mute everybody. I'm gonna switch over to Robert. I just do want to leave you with the point that if you are welcome to use this assignment, but the point is not really the assignment. The point is can you use whatever writing assignment that you're going to use? Can you connect it back to those readings as a way of talking to the students about what writing is and how writing works? That's really what I want you to take away from this workshop, is how can I use my writing assignments to generate a discussion where students learn and talk and think through how writing works. So that's really what I want to have you think about. Robert, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So in many ways, the underlying principles that Chris has been talking about this whole time are very consistent with what I'm going to be talking about now. But what I like about our kind of, it's not our first rodeo, what I like about this little talk that we've come up with is that my assignment and my set of readings and my materials look in many ways entirely unlike everything that Chris has just gone over. But yet a lot of these kind of key principles, challenging the way that students think about writing, both from a construction standpoint and from what writing can and does do, as well as kind of connecting with these kind of key concepts in our field. So I hope that you'll see a lot of resonance between what we just talked about and what I'm going to talk about now. And you'll see that in spite of the fact that on the surface, this looks like a totally different set of readings and a totally different assignment. So I'm going to talk about the part of the OER that has to do with rhetoric, genre, and discourse. And I want to start, before I kind of divide up some of the readings and talk about some of the key sections within the OER, I want to start with this kind of big question that comes from the first page of one of our recommended readings. Why rhetoric? Why incorporate rhetoric directly or explicitly into the classroom? And what I'm going to be talking about today is basically like a unit. That could be a quarter or a third, depending on how much time you want to spend on it, excuse me, of a semester. And so why talk about rhetoric? So rhetoric, first off, rhetoric is an important part of our subject area, right? We get to lay claim to one of the oldest academic disciplines in human history. We might as well run with it. And rhetoric gives us the vocabulary, the terms, the concepts to talk about writing in ways that are more expansive than our students have experience with coming from high school and from their prior educational experiences. And that vocabulary is not complex. It's not a lot of terms. It's relatively modest, but it gives us a lot of opportunities to talk about writing in new ways. It also, and this is something I'll come back to a lot, it expands students' ideas about texts and context, or excuse me, text and content, and what the difference is between what a text does, how it functions, how it maybe persuades, maybe not, maybe prompts empathy or causes someone to change their attitudes or feelings, or just prompts someone to be curious and want to learn new things about something, how texts really affect viewers or readers versus the content that's in them. I'm actually giving feedback on rhetorical analyses, which is what I'm going to be talking about in a few moments right now. And you know, I will often get students who say something like, I think that this video would be highly persuasive and very effective because it has lots of facts. And I'm thinking, okay, really? Someone gives you a couple of facts, you just change your mind, right? Rhetoric gives us the terminology to start pushing back on some of those assumptions that all that matters in a text is its content, and pushes us to start thinking about what texts do, how they affect and influence real people, real readers. And I won't talk much about this now, but a little later I'll get into the fact that the basic terms and concepts in rhetoric also allow us to explore and understand genre and discourse, which are two potentially very useful concepts as students progress through their college careers. So let me just give a very quick overview of the OER itself and break out a couple of the readings into some kind of functional categories. And I will say this part of the talk, as I discovered a couple days ago when we first did this, is pretty boring, so please bear with me. So the first category of readings in the rhetoric section that I want to just touch on are the Purdue OWL PowerPoint, the Loesch reading, which is what I showed you the screen grab for. It's a graphic novel guide to writing and rhetoric. and the Ross Kelly reading, What Do Students Need to Know About Rhetoric. These 3 readings are going to introduce students to the very basic key terms and concepts in rhetoric. And I will explain in just a moment what I mean when I say the key terms and concepts in rhetoric. But these readings, all or some of them, can help students to get introduced to and to start to learn some of the kind of just the basic terms, the concepts, the vocabulary. We've also included a couple of readings here that are more assignment specific, that tie into particular kinds of assignments that you might be doing or kinds of writing you might ask your students to complete. So the CAT reading is one that I'll recommend for the assignment I'm going to talk about today. It's Steps Toward Rhetorical Analysis, and that is pretty obviously about rhetorical analysis. This is a good reading to excerpt. It's very dense, but if you just have students really focus on a couple of key pages based on what you want them to do, this can be a hugely beneficial resource. If you're doing anything where you are going to dig into argument, this is a great reading, Finding the Good Argument or Why Bother with Logic. This is a reading I use not only with my first-year writers, depending on what I'm doing that semester, but also with my upperclassmen in critical writing. So this is a reading that really spans a lot of potential uses. And finally, a classic first-year writing text. Oh, it even says classic right there. How to Say Nothing in 500 Words. Kind of pushing back on the idea of the effectively empty and pointless, but nevertheless full of words high school essay. Finally, you'll find 2 readings in here that I'll come back to a little bit later. The Dirk reading, Navigating Genres, and the Borg reading, Discourse Community, that dig into these 2 key concepts in rhetoric that are worth talking about if you have the time and you've already introduced the very basics of rhetoric. So that's Dirk is about genre and Borg is about discourse communities. All right, so I am going to go over, similar to the way that Chris did, an example of a very basic assignment that you can use to introduce terms and concepts in rhetoric. And that is a rhetorical comparison of 2 videos. So in this assignment, I ask my students to find 2 videos, usually on YouTube, that are related to their topics. Short, 1 to 5 minutes. And I don't really have any rules other than they have to be relatively short, they have to be related to their topics, and I discourage them from picking videos that are kind of rhetorically uninteresting. And the 2 most common examples of that I give are, 1, person looking into camera and just talking extemporaneously about the topic. And 2 is like your CBS evening news type thing. Those tend not to be particularly useful, but the web is absolutely full of interesting public service announcements and kind of multimedia informational videos that provide a lot of great material for rhetorical analysis. So once they find those 2 videos, all I ask them to do is to evaluate those videos in terms of 2 concepts in rhetoric, the rhetorical situation and the rhetorical appeals. That's it. Once they've done that for each of the 2 videos, I ask them to compare the videos in terms of their effectiveness. So it's a very simple assignment that just asks them to lay out a couple of key concepts and apply those concepts in very basic terms to a couple of relatively simple audiovisual texts. And this deals, just a quick recap, this deals with 4 of the readings from the OER. I don't always use all 4. I will usually use 1 or 2 of the red readings and the blue. So again, that's the Introducing Key Terms in Rhetoric, Purdue OWL PowerPoint, the Loesch, and the Ross Kelly. And I will usually either give the entirety or an excerpt from the Carroll reading to help them actually understand what a rhetorical analysis is. So I've been talking about key concepts in rhetoric, and I think it can be very easy to think that I'm kind of pushing on this kind of big, kind of history of information in the field, but really I'm talking about a very small number of very basic concepts. And these are concepts that do an enormous amount of work. This is literally the entirety of what I teach in this unit in terms of terms and concepts from rhetoric. The author, the purpose, the audience, the context, and the 3 classic Greek rhetorical appeals, ethos, pathos, logos. That's it. And in fact, the vast majority of what my students write about and what I talk about and what we cover in class has just to do with audience, purpose, and persuasion. Audience, purpose, and appeals. That's it. Because these are actually fairly radical in terms of the way that students think about writing. Aside from my teacher, students don't ever think about the audience for their texts consciously. They think about the audience for their text unconsciously all the time when they go on media, when they read and write online, but they don't consciously think about audience. And even in a school setting where they are, we say that students are thinking that their teacher is the audience, which is always problematic from the standpoint of getting them to learn more broadly about how to write and communicate. But even then, they're really not thinking of their teacher as an audience in the rhetorical sense. They're just thinking of their teacher as someone who wants them to follow instructions and go step by step through something. And they almost never think about purpose. School does not encourage, under almost any circumstances, students to think about what their texts do, or having goals for texts, or trying to achieve something through a piece of writing or through a multimodal communication. They are taught to think only about content. Do you have 5 paragraphs? Does each body paragraph resemble the paragraph on the poster in the classroom with a big picture of a hamburger on it? Like, it's entirely about form and it's entirely about content, but not content to do something. So really all I'm trying to get them to do is to think about how audiences will actually react to texts and how texts can achieve purposes. And these are the basic concepts that we use to do that. So I do think it's very important, and Chris said something similar in his portion, to talk about rationale, both among ourselves and with our students. And so there are a couple of reasons why I think this is a useful and valuable assignment. So number one, it provides a fairly clear and direct way to introduce and apply rhetorical terms and concepts. Complex rhetorical analysis is very difficult, but by kind of boiling it down to a couple of key terms and asking them to look at audio-visual texts which they're more comfortable and familiar with, I find that students can develop the ability to discuss rhetoric and writing in terms of these rhetorical elements. So it's very useful in that sense. It's also very useful because it gives us terminology to talk about writing and communication in ways that would be difficult if we didn't have this vocabulary in the classroom. And so when we get to later assignments, particularly after we had a conversation about genre, but when we get to later assignments and we're talking about something like, for example, a literature review in the vein of what's written in the social sciences, like sociology or psychology, we now have a vocabulary through our conversations about rhetoric and about genre to talk about why a literature review does not look like an essay, or it does not look like a piece of creative writing. And yet, all of the things that they were told, or I'm being generous to their high school teachers, many of the things that they were told about essays might still be true, even if they don't translate to another genre. And rhetoric gives us a vocabulary to talk about that and to introduce the ideas of genre and discourse so that they can start to demystify the very rapidly increasing different types of texts that they will have to write as college students and eventually as professionals. And the last part of the rationale, which I talked about already, was the idea that the rhetorical terminology helps us to expand the way that students talk about writing and to think about the communicative effectiveness of a text and the way that it influences an audience in more real terms, as opposed to just it checks the boxes. So in order to help them get to that point where they can produce a rhetorical analysis, even a basic one, there are a couple of scaffolding activities that I do, depending on how your class is allocated, 2 versus 3 days a week, and depending on how much time you want to spend on each of these elements. These can be a significant part of a class, or they could be an entire day. So there's 4 basic activities I almost always do to help students grapple with the terms and understand what I mean when I'm talking about the rhetorical terminology. So the first thing that I will typically do is just kind of introduce and review the key terms, the ones that I've already shown you and that are covered in the reading. After they've done their reading and written some responses, they'll bring their responses to class, we'll discuss them. I'll put the materials up on the board, we'll kind of very quickly review the definitions. And then I will ask them to do a little bit of identifying. You can do this as at the class level, at the group level, or at the individual level, or multiple over the course of the day. But typically I will start with very simple, short genres that they're fairly familiar with. Social media works great here. You can have them kind of name some of their favorite, like Instagram accounts, for example, and you can take a look at them and see how the creator of that account is communicating to different audiences within their followers and achieving different goals. This works particularly well with accounts that are either professionally or semi-professionally curated. So, for example, big music stars, for example, tend to have social media accounts that, although they themselves contribute to them, they're also somewhat curated by their handlers, etc. So if you look at like Taylor Swift's account, you're going to get this interesting mixture of posts, some of which are clearly professionally oriented and are about trying to promote her new album or tour, some of which are related to promoting social causes, some of which are meant to create the impression that she's relatable and just like us, right? So social media accounts, Twitter feeds, these kinds of things can be very easy opportunities to do kind of quick, ultra minute rhetorical analyses that you can do as a class and get the terminology going. I will also almost always do an in-class activity or some other scaffolding activity related to actually finding the videos. One of the kind of challenges that I often face is that no matter how much I push them on it, students always think of their work in terms of completion and not in terms of long-term effect. And sometimes the class just has to be a place where there are consequences for that, not in the sense of punishment, but in the sense of just long-term, if they're not going out of their way to look at 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 videos and pick 2 really strong ones, they're going to have a harder time down the line. But I almost always will spend a little bit of time in class helping them to hunt for and find really strong videos. They tend to just pick the first few that come across their desk, and so allocating a little bit of time in class to actually looking for videos. I usually start at the class level. They'll call out a topic. We'll do some searches. We'll look for some examples. I'll talk about why I do or don't like particular videos for this assignment. And then I'll have them either individually or in groups do a little bit of looking in class. And when people find really great ones, you'll know. It'll be obvious from their exclamations and body language when they find something really great. You can have them give you the name, you can show it off, you can talk about it. So helping them to kind of identify more rhetorically interesting content for their analysis is always a helpful class. And finally, I have 2 other activities that help them to actually do the analysis. So the first is we do a bunch of analyses in class as a group. I have a YouTube playlist that I've shared with everyone. I'll talk about the artifacts that I have for you all at the end. So I have a YouTube playlist with 21 videos that I think are pretty interesting. I don't go over all of them, but they're worth checking out if you're going to do any kind of video analysis or any kind of multimedia composing. These are just a couple of examples of rhetorically interesting videos. Some of them are ads, some of them are PSAs, a couple of them are informational, but they use visual and auditory elements in interesting ways that are still understandable to our students. On that list, I also have a number of videos, and I've made some notes in the document that contains the link for you all. I found a couple of videos that really do a good job of illustrating very specific rhetorical concepts. So, for example, there's a video that's an ad for a Mercedes AMG Roadster. This is like a $200,000 car, and it's completely incomprehensible to my students because the entire ad is an homage to the film Easy Rider. This will come as a shock to you all, but our students do not go and watch cult classics from the 1960s. So they don't get all. The really clever ones in the room get through context clues that there's some kind of old people movie being referenced here, but that's as far as they get. And so that's like a great example of an opportunity to talk about audience and how this was a Super Bowl ad. Millions of people saw this ad, but only a tiny fraction of the actual viewing audience was the intended audience. And so some of these videos are useful just for kind of general analysis. Some point out specific rhetorical elements, but we'll always do a handful as a class. Usually I will do a few analyses for them or with minimal input, and then we'll build up to either group or individual writing and sharing. The last activity that I think is always great is to inject a little bit of creative writing into the classroom. But very important, the creative writing is not the goal of this activity. It is a tool to further clarify and introduce the concepts about writing that we're learning. So I do an activity I call the rhetorical grab bag. So I'll have them throw out a bunch of audiences, and and then a bunch of either products, services, or causes, things that you might make an ad about. And then I will mix and match and create some pairs randomly. And they will have to figure out a strategy for selling the product or service or advocating for the cause that specifically targets that particular audience. And this gets them thinking more narrowly about audience and about appealing to specific kinds of people with particular interests or demographic characteristics. And sometimes this can yield really great results. I had a group once, they got iPads and seniors, and the class collectively kind of thought this was going to be tough. Because they just assume that older people don't use technology, even though my parents have 2 iPads and 2 iPhones, but that's beside the point. And they actually came up with this really amazing ad that they acted out and kind of diagrammed on the board, where they sold iPads to seniors using the kind of hook of this, that they could use the iPads to FaceTime with their grandkids, and kind of turning the product into like a social family thing. So my students will often run with this and come up with some really great and creative things, and without even realizing it, they're actually thinking much more narrowly about audience than they normally would. So a basic assignment like this is really great at introducing the key underlying concepts. But there's also a couple of ways that this can be, there's a couple of ways that this can expand into the future of both your class and of their experiences as college writers. And this has to do with the concepts of genre and discourse. And we have readings about genre and discourse on the rhetoric page. And I think genre in particular is incredibly important to talk about with students, because so much of the conflict that they have when they think about writing in the college classroom, not just ours, but in college classrooms more broadly, comes from the disconnect that they have between the very narrow world of writing in primary, secondary school, which is almost entirely relegated to book reports and very simplified versions of essays. And as they start to encounter more and more and more genres, and they're asked to write literature reviews and research reports and lab reports or medical charts or law briefs, they are forced to encounter genres in which things they've counted on in the past, strategies and approaches that they've relied on, are not acceptable. And now they're forced to think that their school teacher was full of it, or that their college teacher is. And genre gives us a vocabulary and a concept that we can use to bridge that gap. Because if the book report and essays that they wrote in high school are genres that have certain expectations, and those expectations come from the audience and the purpose, then we have a way to talk about other forms of writing, and they have a way to digest other forms of writing that don't force them into a conflict where they have to think that everything they've heard up to this point is wrong. And that can be a very powerful tool in a course that is, after all, called college writing. And just a quick recap, the Dirk reading is about genre, and the Borg reading is about discourse community. So I've shared some artifacts with you. I will ask Amanda to email this out to the groups at the end of the week, but I'll also put the link and my email address in the chat after I'm done talking. So this link, bit.ly/SP2020, Spring 2020, OER Workshop, all lowercase, is going to take you to a Google, what is it called? It's a Google folder, Google Drive folder, that's what I'm looking for, that has the instructions for the assignment as I teach it, the playlist, the YouTube playlist I referenced, a handful of example student papers, as well as some supporting materials, checklists and writing strategies for the students and other kinds of handouts, and also a description of both the scaffolding activities I went over and some additional follow-up activities, including things like rhetorically based peer review or rhetorically based feedback on student writing. And so you should feel free to look through or use any of these materials. I'm more than happy to share them, and I'm more than happy to share anything else I might have if you shoot me an email if there's something that you're looking for that you don't see. So that's my talk. any questions for me? Or Chris, do you want to just open this up to questions about this or anything, since we only have 20 minutes left?
Why don't we
Nazareth has a question.
let's start out with questions about Robert's section, about the rhetoric section and Robert's assignment, and then we'll open it up to questions about anything.
Nazareth, you can just unmute yourself.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, Robert. Yeah, I have a question specifically about what you were discussing.
Sure.
And I just want to share a rhetorical analysis assignment that I used in 1100, similar to what you did with the videos. And I used a lot of those readings to set it up. We did some activities in class. And very quickly, I asked them to select, this was for a longer essay, to select a piece of media, could be social media and anything on media, and do a rhetorical analysis, looking at the appeals, the arguments, the audience, et cetera, right? A lot of the similar discourses that you were addressing. For the most part, they were receptive, and a lot of, I mean, I do multiple drafts, so we were able to work through it. But there was a lot of resistance because many of them have been programmed in secondary school, high school, et cetera, to write these research papers. So a lot of them had a lot of difficulty understanding what a rhetorical analysis is. Many of them fell back to writing essentially a research paper based on content, right? Like you were discussing.
Yeah.
Of course, I set it up. I went through the readings. I explained it. We did exercises in class, but there were still several students who just struggled with. Fortunately, there were multiple drafts, and I could go over it with them. But nonetheless, a lot of them were having difficulty understanding what a rhetorical analysis is and how to write in that vein, as opposed to what they have been trained. And this extends to all the classes, to be honest, which you and I have talked about. So, this was really an issue that I saw with this.
Yes. So there's a couple of things that I'll say about that. One is that I always, when I'm thinking about an assignment, I always think about an assignment in terms of what are the things that are going to push students to learn something new or challenge them, and what are the things that are going to ground this and make it easier for them to respond to. And I think one of the mistakes that I've made in the past was too much pushing and not enough grounding. And so, for example, for this assignment, I don't mandate it, and my A students don't do it. But for those who are struggling, I give them a paragraph by paragraph breakdown. I'm extremely formulaic with this. And the reason I'm extremely formulaic with this particular assignment is that conceptually, it's a lot of new stuff. It's a lot of new challenge. And I'm actually, normally in my teaching, much more resistant to the idea of prescribing exact formulas in terms of like this paragraph does this paragraph does that, because I think that robs students of certain key ideas about how composing works and how ideas and form are interrelated. But in an assignment like this, where they have, in most cases, never consciously thought about audience or purpose or persuasion in these ways, I want there to be something that students who are anxious or struggling can fall back on, and they can say, okay, I may not be 100% sure what he means, even though we've talked about it many times, when he says intended audience. But I can write a paragraph where I give my best guess and submit that as a kind of zero draft or first draft that I can get feedback on and that can be reinforced. And so I have kind of backed off. With my upperclassmen, I teach this as an essay where they actually formulate an argument, claims, etc. But my freshmen, I don't. I teach it almost like a form. And I say, look, I don't like that, but it's one piece of writing for the semester. And if I commit this sin here in order to have the virtue of teaching them rhetorical vocabulary, that's fine. We can build on that later. So the second thing is just scaffold the hell out of it. Like I said, I'm teaching it right now. And so like I look at, they do a very first rough brainstorm about the rhetorical features of the text, and I check in with them. Then they turn that into an actual multi-paragraph, just like a 1 to 2 page analysis of one video. I check in on that. Then they do a second, so it's really broken up. We do a lot of the work in class, and the reality is also one of the things that I've also found is that in a lot of cases, the proportion of your students who crush it, the proportion of your students who pull through, and the portion of your students who struggle like hell and don't make it for whatever reason tends not to change all that much depending on how I change the content and assignments in my class within reason, right? Short of going crazy and making it impossibly hard or impossibly easy, you're going to get a lot of your students are going to fall in the same basic categories. So you might as well construct a class that deals with writing and communication in the ways that are meaningful and powerful, and then worry about helping along those students who are going to struggle, because they're probably going to struggle no matter what.
Okay, that's a good point.
I just wanted to jump in and add to that, because it's really interesting to me that in one form or another, this question came up for both of us, Robert, that we're basically asking students to do something different, which is to think about writing as a process and to be conscious of that process. When students are used to thinking of writing as transferring content into a certain form, and that's a struggle for them. So one thing that I think all of what Robert said, scaffolding and trying to make it, as you're making one task complex, trying to make the steps simple, I think that's really important. I think noting that it doesn't really matter what you do, some students are going to crush it and some students are going to struggle, is important. Another element I would throw in that's important is reflection. Because throughout this course, we're asking students to look at writing differently than they're used to, it really becomes important to give them chances to stand back and to talk about what they struggled with, where they had breakthroughs, where they had stuck points. So I think building into the semester, Robert and I haven't really talked about it in terms of this assignment, but building into the semester, lots of opportunities for them to do short or maybe even longer pieces of writing, saying, what's been going on here? What are you getting? What are you not getting? Has your view of writing changed? That's another important element of this process. And there are some readings in the writing process section that talk about reflection. Other questions? Either for Robert and his assignment or just about the whole thing generally? Loretta and not Lorraine. Loretta, make sure you unmute your mic.
I want you to read my lips. That's more fun. Okay, listen. Just a general question, because you were talking about your persuasive piece and Robert was talking about rhetoric, which is in essence persuasion. So you want the goals of these classes to be that form of writing, rhetoric. So in other words, we're not to encourage narrative or creative writing. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah,
okay. Yeah. It just seems like this focus of this conference right now that we're doing is on all rhetoric, persuasion, but I often find like once in a while I'll give them an assignment to just write like a little script for a TV show. They love it. And it just gets them writing. So I'm just saying that.
No, I think the short answer to your question is no. We are not saying, oh, we want the form of writing in this class to be persuasive. In fact, I'm kind of making the case the other way around. I don't think persuasive writing is the most useful form. So I want to reiterate, the point is not, we're not talking about what genres you should write in. And in fact, if anything, I think we're arguing against setting up a college writing class in terms of the modes. I don't think a good college writing class is one that begins with narrative writing and then goes to persuasive writing and then goes to expository writing. I think those are bullshit modes. What we're really trying to do is say, if you're going to give them a creative writing assignment, fine, but tell me what the point is. Because the point needs to be something more than, oh, it's going to be fun for them, or, oh, it'll just get them writing. Those are not really good rationales for giving a writing assignment. whatever writing assignment you're giving, and it could be narrative, there could be lots of different kinds of writing, but the question is, what are you trying to teach them? And I'm hoping that the answer is you're trying to teach them something about the way the writing process works. So my assignment was trying to teach students about how you can use writing to imagine different points of view. And Robert's assignment was trying to teach them about whatever piece of writing you have, there's always an audience, there's always a purpose, and there's always these different circumstances that are meeting to create a particular piece of writing. Rhetoricians would say every piece of writing is persuasive. That fiction, for instance, is trying to persuade you to enter into a particular world. So it's not that we want specific modes to be the point. It's whatever your writing assignment, ask yourself, what is this assignment teaching them about the writing process? And make sure that there's ample opportunity in the class to talk about what they're learning, because you can't just assume, oh, they're going to do the assignment and learn it. One of the things that we've learned as writing scholars over the years is you need to make your terminology explicit. You need to say, what are the terms that you're using to have this conversation? You need to say, having gone through this process, okay, how did this writing process help develop your thoughts about what you were going to say? You need to make that process of how writing works really central to your class. I'm not sure, hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, it did. It's just a struggle sometimes to get them thinking metacognitively, maybe in the first, but that's the goal.
They're not, none of schooling is, if I can make a huge generalization, most of their schooling is not set up to support this kind of thinking.
Right.
So it is really baby steps. You are asking them to do something that's that they have not had a lot of practice doing.
Thank you.
Robert, is there anything you want to say about that?
No, I mean, I don't know. So I highlighted the reading that you referenced, Chris, and this is the Sandra Giles reading about reflective writing, and that's in the writing process section, just so everyone can find it. I think that both of our assignments, I don't want to say they're about persuasion. They respond to persuasion. My assignment is 100% about persuasion in the modern rhetoric sense of, virtually any communicative text is persuasive in some way. But that's not the way that the students interpret or interact with the word persuasive writing. They're not thinking about, oh, this Snickers ad is trying to make me happy and laugh so that I create a cognitive association between happiness and Snickers. That's not what they think of when they think of persuasion. So my assignment is entirely about persuasion in this more complicated way, but it's definitely not about the persuasive essay in the kind of high school sense of the word. I think that there are ways in which you can harness, to a limited extent, certain kinds of writing like narrative and creative writing, if it is in the service of these larger goals. So I have that activity, like I said, that creative activity where they kind of come up and act out the ad. But it's not just for its own sake. It's not just to get them to do something creative. It is for the specific purpose of getting them to think about text and communication in particular ways. So I wouldn't say that the goal of 1100 is to teach about persuasion. I would definitely not say that. I think the goal of 1100 is to have them think about and look at writing and communication in an honest way, right? And in an honest way, nobody who writes well sits down and taps out perfect pieces of writing in one shot. Everybody gets feedback from their peers or goes through multiple drafts, from professional writers on down. And that's a more honest way of talking about writing and talking about the process of constructing something. So that I think is, for me, it's about trying to make their understanding of writing more honest.
Anybody else with a question or a concern or a fear or a hope? Well, I want to thank everybody. You know, I know for some of this was easy, but I think for some of us, I know technology is a challenge for some folks. We totally appreciate you having this conversation with us, and we're going to record these sessions, and we're going to put one of them up on the website for you to reference if you want to go back to it. And please feel free to email me or email Robert or email Amanda if you guys have any questions. Be well, be safe, and
thank you, everyone.
Thank you.